What's up, Miracle Fighters? It's Pton here and welcome back to the Team Miracle 4 channel. Today we'll be discussing one of my favorite V Premium decks from one of my favorite clans, the Tachikaze Gaia Emperor deck. So I've always been a big fan of Gaia Emperor since G era, and I'm so glad to have him return back to standard V Premium rather. However, even though his first iteration and initial performance wasn't really up to par to a lot of decks in the same set as him, which is in VBT 10, with the new support from Clan Selection Plus Volume 1, the deck has become a lot better. Clan Selection fixed a few issues that I used to have and have upped its consistency as well as skill level by a lot. Just like the other V Premium Tachikaze decks, this deck will focus on equip gauges. However, the difference is that the quantity of equip gauges are not so important as the quality of the equip gauges that you have. With this deck, your main playstyle will be superior calling from the gauge, so if you want a strong multi-attack turn, your gauge has to consist of good units. Everything will be much more clearer once we start showing off card skills, so without further ado, let's get right into the deck. Alright, so we'll start off first with the starter. We're playing Minimum Kano. Doesn't matter which starter you choose, Dragon Egg or Minimum Kano. Dragon Egg has been with us for like 2 Tachikaze sets, so it's time to move on to a newer starter. And we'll be starting first with the grade 3s. Let's move the deck aside. Oops, there goes the dice. For the grade 3s, we are playing first up 4 copies of the main card, Emperor Dragon Gaia Emperor. So here's 2 abilities. Okay, have a look. The first is a continuous passive power up. During your turn, all of your rear guards with equipped gauge get plus 5,000 power. If your opponent's Vanguard is grade 3 or greater, they get plus 10,000 power instead. So it's a sweet free power up and it's always welcomed, in my opinion. Right. Being able to get 5 or 10k just for having an equipped gauge is super relevant in this deck as well, as it makes your multi-attacks force more guard and makes even low-grade units, such as the grade 1s, able to hit force Vanguards, or just able to hit Vanguards without any boost. Gaia Emperor's main effect is its second ability, which is when it attacks, counterblast 1 and retire a rear guard, and Gaia Emperor gets the power of the retired unit. If your opponent's Vanguard is grade 3 or greater, it gets the original critical as well. This is a really neat effect that basically starts off the combo chain that this deck is capable of. Tachikaze in V Premium, just like in the old format, has lots of cards whose abilities activate when retired. Gaia Emperor is basically one of many such, I would say, effect enablers, right? It helps to create the combos and get the deck's engine up and running. It's a simple ability, but it synergizes and turns the deck into a pretty strong combo deck. This ability of Gaia Emperor is also what made me like him much more than the other Tachikaze VRs. And that's because it's more reminiscent of old school Tachikaze, where your main Vanguard retires your rear guards to get power, critical, and then from there on, crazy combos may appear and stuff like that. So, yeah. For now, just keep in mind this ability because it will be very important in knowing how the deck works overall. So, yep, 4 Gaia Emperors. For the backup grade 3, we are playing 3 copies of this new card from Clan Selection Plus Volume 1, that is the Light Battle Dragon Gigannoblazer. Let's focus. Okay. So this is actually your first right target for the deck because of how well it sets up the field in preparation for your Gaia push. Gigannoblazer has 2 effects. The first is similar to Gaia Emperor as a passive power up ability. However, it's only it's kept at 5k, but it has a different condition. Its condition is that if 3 or more new equipped gauges were put for units this turn, then all of your front row units get plus 5k. It's slightly weaker than Gaia Emperor, but it doesn't require that all of the units need to have gauge in order to reap its full benefits. And also, its second effect pretty much enables this power up as well, so in a way it's much easier than Gaia Emperor to fulfill. Now for Gigannoblazer's second effect, which is the main reason why we are playing him, is it's an activated ability on Vanguard Circle. You may Counterblast 1 and Soul Blast 1. Draw 2 cards and call 2 cards from your hand to Rearguard Circle. Put up to 1 card from the top of your deck face down as an equip gauge for those units. This basically allows you to not only fulfill 2/3 of the condition for its own power up, but being able to draw 2 means that you're digging through your deck at quite a rapid rate, and this allows you to really search for your combo pieces and also to set up your gauges and your rear guards for your next turn Gaia Emperor. Previously, Tachikaze has always suffered from a small hand size and not seeing their pieces, because we're a deck that is kind of pace reliant. So with such a potent draw power in the form of Gigannoblazer, the deck now has better search power and also better surviving power, because you're drawing cards, you're increasing your hand size, you're plussing quite a bit, and in the long run, it means that you're not going to be burning out that easily as before. However, Gigannoblazer himself does not enable combo plays, for he doesn't retire your rear guards. So I guess this isn't really that big of an issue depending on what you have on the field, but generally to push for game, you do want to still go into Gaia Emperor for the subsequent rights. Gaia Emperor, if you guys still remember, has its main effect fully active if the opponent is on grade 3. So if you're going first, Gaia Emperor is sort of better as a second right, and that's where, you know, Gigannoblazer really shines, because you can just go into Gigannoblazer first and just set up a hand, set up a field in preparation for Gaia Emperor. Just helps you to secure pieces pretty much. So yeah, I'm playing 3 copies because it's not exactly the main card, but you do want to see it in the early game, I guess. Right. So that's 3 Giganoblazers. And before we move on to the rest of the deck, as with typical Tachikaze style, there will be lots of cards in this deck that retire the rearguard, and lots of cards with abilities that activate when retired from rearguard circle. Thus, since we've already introduced the main Vanguard as well as our backup Vanguard, from here on we'll be splitting the rest of the deck into 2. Those who seek to retire, which I'm going to term them the Predators, and those who exist to be retired by the Predators, and I'm going to term them as the Prey. So it's kind of a misnomer for the Predators group, since some of the dinosaurs the cards are based off are classified or considered herbivores, but who knows, dinosaurs on planet Krayt may be a little different in their behavior. But anyways, that's kind of off topic, so without further ado, let's get right into the Predators. So for the Predators, besides Gaia Emperor, we have our last grade 3, and that is 2 copies of the Sundering Dragon Terra Therizino. Let's have a closer look at his effect. On Vanguard and Rearguard circle, when it attacks a Vanguard, retire 1 other Rearguard to draw a card, and if you retire a Rearguard with an equip gauge for this cost, you can choose one of your opponent's Rearguards and retire it. This is a really sweet effect, as not only is it a costless retire, but it's also our main form of removal, or rather our only form of removal in this deck. This definitely comes in handy because this ability can help to snipe pesky back row boosters or intercepts even in the battle phase to force your opponents to use up more of the hand cards to guard. However, we are only playing 2 copies of him though, because honestly we don't need too many of him. Unlike the other Predator cards, he doesn't add gauge anywhere, so too many of him without any gauge adders will turn out to be counterproductive. But I really like him because of his costless retire. So being a costless retire means that, you know, it gives us more free play with our damage. And yep, I'm playing 2 copies of him, Terra Therizino. Other than Terra Therizino, our other Predators comes in the form of grade 2s, right? They fill up our grade 2 slots, namely the Extortion Dragon Spinal Extort and the Ravenous Dragon Mega Rex. So I'm sure you guys already know about Mega Rex. It's pretty much a staple card in Tachikaze, right? V Premium by now. Since it has been present in almost every Tachikaze build due to its ability to contribute in 2 ways. Firstly, it helps to retire your own rearguards, and secondly, it also adds gauge. So its effect reads, on Vanguard and Rearguard circle, when it attacks a Vanguard, you may retire another Rearguard and draw a card. This is exactly the same as Terra Therizino. However, instead of retiring the opponent's Rearguard, his skill continues. If this unit is on Rearguard circle, counterblast 1, and you may gauge it. And then it gets 5000 power until end of battle for each gauge equipped to itself. This means that if he originally has 1 gauge and you use this ability to add a gauge, he gets plus 10k, right? Adding on to the passive power up of your main Vanguards, Gaia Emperor and Gigannoblazer, he's able to easily hit for some pretty nice numbers on his own, such as 24k, etc. And also, if you ever need additional numbers to hit past damage triggers that your opponents check during the battle phase, or you just need a beefy rearguard that plays a similar role to Sweeper Aggro Canto even, this card has the most potential for that. So just a heads up, this deck does not run Sweeper Aggro Canto, so Mega Rex is probably our potentially highest attacker. So yeah, mainly Mega Rex is in here for the free retire and free combo extender, just like Terra Therizino. Though its gauging can also come in really handy as well, such as, you know, triggering the 3rd gauge for Giganoblazer's first effect. As for the other grade 2, we have 4 copies of Extortion Dragon Spinal Extort. Now this is a new card from Clan Selection Plus that came out with Gigannoblazer, and it is, I would say, is one of the top contenders for being the new staple of Tachikaze. So it has one ability on Vanguard and Rearguard Circle. When it attacks a Vanguard, counterblast 1 and retire another Rearguard, and you can draw a card. So once again, very similar to the other Predators like Terratherizino and Mega Rex, retire and draw. Okay. However, I would say that its effect is what really brings out the combo potential of this deck. After you retire that Rearguard, you can call up to 1 card from the equip gauge of the unit retired for this cost to Rearguard Circle, and you may also give that unit a gauge. In other words, this card extends an additional attack from a retire. As you'll see down the line, we do have other attack extenders in this deck, but those are mostly prey cards that rely on you retiring them with other predators. So it's sort of a 2-card combo where you need a predator and a prey. But when it comes to Spinal Extort, he's a built-in predator that turns everyone into potential prey. And by prey, I mean the special kind of prey like Regiodon and Blue Sprint, which are cards that can superior call cards from their gauge in order to create multi-attacks. And that is the whole playstyle of the deck. Spinal Extort is a very important and very useful card because in certain games, you don't really see your attack extenders, and you may be forced to retire non-prey cards like maybe a Rearguard grade 3 or whatever for the draw, right? This card makes it such that anything you retire, as long as it has a gauge under it, can help you to create an additional attack. I also like the fact that it gauges the card called by its effect, meaning that the superior called card will still get a power up from Gaia Emperor, allowing it to, maybe still be able to hit the Vanguard unboosted. All in all, Spinal Extort is a solid card that in a way combines 2 kinds of skills into one and increases the skill ceiling of this deck quite a bit. So most of the predators here, they are net zeros in terms of card advantage, but for Spinal Extort, it's definitely a +1. Right, you retire your Rearguard to draw a card, and then you still get to call a card from under the gauge of the retired unit to the field. It's just a really nice card overall, Spinal Extort. So yeah, I'm playing 4 copies of him, and if you remember that I mentioned Gigannoblazer doesn't retire your Rearguards, so Spinal Extort will be one of the main Rearguards that you want to see if you're on Gigannoblazer. And that's pretty much all the predators, so we have 8 plus Gaia Emperor, that would be 12. Now with that said, a predator is only really as good as the prey that it kills. Hence, the prey cards are just as important, and I'd argue maybe even more important in this deck, especially since our main Vanguard is already a built-in predator. Let's begin with our main retire targets, which also sets the foundation for the whole playstyle of the deck. Here we have 3 copies of Regiment Dragon Regiodon, and 4 copies of Darting Dragon Blue Sprint. These 2 cards are basically carbon copies of each other, except that they have different grades and different card names, which is sort of relevant, as you'll see when I explain their effects. So, 2 effects, right? The first is on Vanguard and Rearguard Circle, when it attacks, you may put the top card of a deck face down as an equip gauge for one of your Rearguards. Any Rearguard. Generally, these cards do still want to be gauging themselves because of 2 main reasons. Firstly, if you gauge themselves, they can get the power up from Gaia Emperor. And secondly, their second ability sort of requires them to have an equip gauge. However, do take note that in very specific cases, you do want to be stacking gauges, and for that I'll explain after I talk about their second effect. But basically, their second effect is when retired from Rearguard Circle by your card's ability, you can call a card from this unit's gauge to Rearguard Circle, then gauge it. This ability is a hard once per turn, so it can only be used by a card with the same card name once a turn. Hence, remember why I mentioned it was important that these 2 cards have different grades and different card names is because then, let's say you activated Regiodon's effect once, you can still activate Blue Sprint's effect the same turn, which makes your turns flow better, in my opinion. So yeah, I'm sure this skill is kind of straightforward, and you guys should be able to visualize the multi-attacking combo already. The main plan of action is basically to attack with these guys first, then attack with a predator to kill these guys, and then create 1 more attack. So these guys usually have 1 gauge equipped to them, but sometimes you actually do want to be stacking gauges on these guys because of the interaction with these guys and Spinal Extort. What I like to do is to have Regiodon or Blue Sprint get at least 2 gauges. So their first gauge could be from Gigannoblazer's effect. Right. And then the second gauge could be from their own ability. So you have Regiodon attack, gauge itself. And then you attack, with Spinal Extort. And with Spinal Extort's effect, you counterblast 1, retire, let's say, Regiodon. You can draw a card and call a gauge from under Regiodon. In this case, we superior call a gauge like that. And then because of Regiodon's own ability, you get to superior call another card from under the gauge. Meaning that you manage to call 2 cards just from 1 retire. This is super value because depending on the cards in Regiodon's gauge, you can either create a column or you can create 2 additional attacks through 1 predator-prey interaction. Furthermore, since both Spinal Extort and Regiodon can gauge the called units, if you happen to be on Gaia Emperor, you can easily create a buffed up column or multi-attackers that can still hit the Vanguard unboosted. And that's the main combo that you're really looking to perform for your games. It's a really fun attack extending combo that can explode into even more plays if you manage to call out a Blue Sprint from a Regiodon. Oh yeah, and before I move on, most of the time I also like to place my prey units like these 2 cards on the XL circle, because then when we call the cards from the gauge, we can better abuse the XL circle's power up to hit over damage triggers. So yeah, I'm playing 4 Blue Sprints and 3 Regiodons. I try to play as many of them, but because of their hard 1/Pton status, I also don't really want to clog up my field with them because additional copies will not be able to use their call from gauge effect. So generally you just need 1 of each on the field per turn, right? So yeah, overall these 2 cards are absolutely essentials to the deck, as they are not only free gauging engines, but also your main combo pieces needed for this deck's multi-attack combo plays. Okay. Besides attack extenders, we also need some utility prey cards. For that, we have 2 types of cards: the ever-trusty Vicious Claw Dragon Laceratorex, and the recently appreciated Sharp Thorn Dragon Polacan Spine. So Laceratorex is very simple. On plays, it gauges itself, and then when retired from rearguard circle, you may Soul Blast 1 and then retrieve the gauge. It could do it to your hand. Being an on-plays gauge itself is a big bonus because firstly it sets off Gigannoblazer, and secondly it guarantees that it gets the power up from Gaia Emperor. And then with the second effect, basically with the way that retires work in this deck, most of the time you'll be getting a plus of this card. Right, similar to Blue Sprint and Regiodon, Laceratorex also has similar interactions with Spinal Extort, in that when retired by Spinal Extort, if Laceratorex has 2 gauges, you can have Spinal Extort call 1 of the gauge and Laceratorex to return the other, which I think is really neat. Right. Also, Laceratorex synergizes really well with Gigannoblazer. It's one of the main cards that you may consider calling with Gigannoblazer's effect, because then you can just call 2 and be able to gauge 3 at 1 go. Right, since Gigannoblazer calls 2 and gauges 2, and then Laceratorex's own effect will gauge 1 more, meaning that you hit the 3 gauge requirement. As for the other utility prey card, we have Polacan Spine. I found a Japanese one here because I'm missing 1 English one, but basically this card really didn't see much play when it first came out, up until when players started damage denying Engorge, that it started seeing more play, and now in the Gaia Emperor deck, which is a counterblast heavy combo oriented deck, it's almost a must play now, at least in 2 copies, right, which is what I have in my deck. So Polacan Spine's ability is, when retired, activate the abilities below according to the total number of gauges that you have across the board. If you have 1 or more, you soul charge 1, 2 or more, you counter charge 1, and if you have 3 or more, you can move all of its gauges to 1 of your other rear guards. This card single-handedly does so many things for the deck. Not only does it replenish your resources and pays back for literally Gigannoblazer's cost, but it also prevents itself from wasting the gauges. Right, by moving its gauge to others when it is retired, means that we can safely gauge it for the power boost provided by Gaia Emperor, and then sack it later with the card's effect to move its gauge to another card. A transferable gauge is a neat idea as it means that one gauge can be used to power up 2 units at once, if you think about it. A selective moving of gauge also means that it can store its gauge and then move it later on in the game to a rearguard that utilizes the gauge better. For example, your Regiodons, Blue Sprints, and maybe even Lacerata Rex. All in all, Polycan Spine is a solid card, even though it only has 7k base power. But as a whole, the utility it provides makes up for its lack in power. I guess 7k is not that bad as well, since Gaia Emperor gives your rearguards with your quick gauge plus power. So yeah, power is not that big of an issue, and I just really like Polycan Spine. I would say that the main usage of Polycan Spine in this deck is really for the counter charge effect, because it allows us to continue on with our combo plays even if we are down to just a few counter blasts. In cases where we are being damage denied as well, Polycan Spine can be a godsend as well. Do note that unlike Regiodon and Blue Sprint, Lacerata Rex and Polycan Spine don't necessarily have to be retired through card effects, so their effects turn live even if you call over them normally. Sometimes because of our superior calling, we tend to call over certain cards, so if you do call over these two cards, their effects will still activate. I've had occasions where I misgrade, and then opening hand I see 1 or 2 Lacerata Rexes, I call them down, use their skill to gauge themselves, and if just nice, the gauges under it is a card with the grade that I'm missing, I can just call over Lacerata Rex to retrieve that card for riding the next turn. Since Lacerata Rex's ability also activates when the opponent retires it, either through their card effects or just by attacking them, if I see Lacerata Rex in the early game, I would not hesitate to just call it down the field and go for some early rush, because if I put it in the front row and it gets killed, I can still get the gauge underneath it back to my hand, right? And most of the time my opponents will not want to retire Lacerata Rex as well, so it makes for some nice mind games, I guess. Since if my opponent kills it, I get a card to hand. If they don't, I can just save it for further combo plays down the line. Same goes for Polycan Spine. If I run out of counter blasts mid combo, if the combo involves calling back units from the gauge, I can just call over Polycan Spine, counter charge, and continue on with other card effects, stuff like that. So these two cards really provide a lot of utility to this deck. That pretty much rounds up the prey. We have a total of 12 prey. I think is a good number to go along with our 12 predators as well. As for our last 2 cards, we have a pair which sort of work together to further enhance your plays, and that is Savage Shooter and the Zealous Horn Dragon Dilophopyro. Dilophopyro is basically a grade 2 mini version of Gigannoblazer. When placed on Vanguard Rearguard Circle, counterblast 1, draw a card and call a card from your hand to Rearguard Circle. It is a +1 that also speeds up engaging, which is nice. However, I play it mainly for its second effect, which is when it's placed from your card's equipped gauge, it gets plus 10,000 power until the end of turn. Meaning that it'll hit for 24k on its own on the next L2, and that's not counting any further boost given to it if you also happen to gauge it through cards like Blue Sprint, Regiodon, Spinal Extort, etc. This card is the main card you want to be calling from your gauges to push for damage, as it's likely the highest attacker on its own that uses no counterblast at all. Now before I continue, Dilophopyro was a card that came out with Gaia Emperor and Regiodon and Blue Sprint because it was meant to be used with them. However, back when it first came out, it was 2 luck based and not consistent at all, right? While its first ability meant that it saw play in a few builds because it's a generically good effect, its second effect rarely popped off due to the random nature of gauging. What it needed was selective gauging, which was not present to the clan at that time. However, with the new clan selection set, we're introduced to a new grade 1 Savage Shooter. And I guess with this card, Tachikaze has finally gotten a card with a step in the right direction. So Savage Shooter, the only non-dino normal unit that we have, has 2 effects, right? The first is one that is pretty similar to Dilophopyro. It's when placed on Vanguard Circle, Soul Blast 1, draw a card and call a card from your hand to Vanguard Circle, and you may gauge it. So it's only limited to Vanguard Circle, so that makes Savage Shooter the prime right target. And being a Soul Blast cause is actually appreciated as well, because we do want to save our counter blasts for our more important counterblasting units like Spinal Extort, Gaia Emperor, etc. But this effect, this superior calling effect on a grade 1 body actually might be the strongest superior caller in this deck, because you can actually bring out your powerful grade 2s and powerful grade 3s as early as turn 1. What I mean is that depending on the build and the deck that this card is in, it can open up certain powerful plays, like maybe even calling a Sweeper Acrocanto as early as turn 1, or using insanely powerful grade 3s like Savage Mercenary to rush the opponent down in the early game. The draw power of Savage Shooter also allows us to start digging for pieces as early as our first turn, which is important since we are a piece reliant combo deck. But the main reason for why Savage Shooter has revived Dilophopyro in a way is because of its second effect. Activated, you may rest itself. If you do, put a card from your drop zone as an equip gauge for one of your rear guards with no equip gauges. You can't stack gauges, but you can in a way selectively gauge cards. Now this opens up a lot of possibilities. Do you need a certain card in the drop zone as a rear guard or hand card? Easy, just rest this guy and pop it into your Regiodon or Blue Sprint or Lacerator X, and then retire them to reap the benefits. I'm sure with this you can already see the obvious implications of this effect with Dilophopyro. Basically, as long as you see one Dilophopyro per game, you'll be able to recycle it indefinitely from the drop zone using Savage Shooter. Once Dilophopyro hits the drop, all you have to do is have Savage Shooter rest itself and chuck Dilophopyro into your Regiodons or Blue Sprints for a guaranteed 19k attacker from the gauge. Make it 24k or even 29k if your Vanguard happens to be Gaia Emperor, which most of the time it is. An even better interaction that Savage Shooter can help with is with Spinal Extort once again, because with Spinal Extort you don't need Regiodon or Blue Sprint to superior call Dilophopyro from the gauge. In fact, Savage Shooter is so flexible that its skill extends to other units that you may need as well, not just Dilophopyro. Sometimes I find myself using this effect to revive Blue Sprint and Regiodon from the drop zone by chucking them under regular cards and then having Spinal Extort retire those cards to superior call Blue Sprint and Regiodon from the gauge. From there we can actually further extend combo plays, and it's just everything gels so well together. Savage Shooter is just what we needed for Tachikaze and what we should have gotten earlier, in my opinion. It would have been better if, Savage Shooter can search the deck to selectively gauge cards, but I think that would be borderline overpowered. So I'm not going to complain about this drop zone gauging that we have going on for Savage Shooter. I'm just glad that we got this card because it really does so much to the deck, especially for the Gaia Emperor variant. So there we have it. That's our 4 copies of Savage Shooter and 2 Dilophopyros. Oh yeah, something interesting before I move on will be that there was a game where I desperately needed a perfect guard. So what I did was I had a draw PG in my drop zone, and I also had a Lacerator Rex on my hand. So what I did was I called on the Lacerator Rex and I used Savage Shooter to put that draw PG from the drop zone under Lacerator Rex. I was able to retire Lacerator Rex with my Predators that turn, and I was able to bring back that draw PG that I gauged into my hand with Lacerator Rex as effect. So knowing that I have the option of recycling used cards from the drop zone really completed the deck for me as a whole. So with that said, we've come to the end of the normal units. We can move on to our triggers. For the triggers, I think it's very simple and basic. We're running 8 crits, 4 draws, the Sentinel draws, draw PGs, and then 4 heals. Having 8 crits keeps the pressure up, and combined with Gaia Emperor's built-in crit can even steal games if you are lucky. 4 heals I feel are mandatory as a way of countercharging in longer games and also as big shield values. Draw PGs are there because as a fail-safe, right? Sentinels are always good to block gigantic Vanguard attacks and stuff. So I do know of deck lists where players play 10 crits and 2 draws as well with the crit Sentinels, because sometimes having to discard with the PGs, draw PGs, hurt a little, right? Because you may end up discarding necessary pieces with the draw PG. Another justification for playing more crits and lesser draws is because this deck actually draws quite a bit already. As mentioned earlier on, with every retire, there's a draw attached to it. If you look at all the Predators that we have, Territory, Xeno, Mega Rex, Spinal Extort, all of them retire and draw. So you're really digging through your deck a lot, and with the gauging added on top of it, your deck can dwindle very quickly in just 2 or 3 turns. So playing lesser draws and playing more crits may actually help you to close the game earlier and prevent deck out. But for now, I've kind of been enjoying 8 crits, 4 draws and 4 heals. I think the draws are still necessary sometimes to draw into your key pieces, right? You can't always guarantee that you write into Gigannoblazer. So there's that. I guess for other alternative trigger options, fronts may work, because with the way the deck plays, it's a multi-attacking kind of deck, and you know, sometimes fronts may just be helpful for you to hit over damage triggers. But overall, I feel that crits are the best triggers to be used with this deck. Fronts are a little bit more complex to use, so I prefer the straightforwardness of crits, since it doesn't really require us to think about attack patterns in a way. As for the Excel marker that you choose, it does depend on matchups and your opening hand, but I actually have been enjoying XL1 a lot with this deck. As I've said, the deck's draw power is kind of insane, and it's possible for you to reach, 7 to 10 card hand sizes. So XL1 in a way can prevent us from unnecessary deck out. The extra power boost from XL1 for our multi attacks may also just be what we need to really close the game as well. So yeah, if there's a deck that can play XL1, I think Gaia Emperor is one such deck. Though sometimes I do still go for XL2 if I find that my hand size is too small, or if I don't have my key pieces in my hand and I really need to draw into certain rear guards and stuff. And with that, that's pretty much the end of the deck. We've gone through all the normal units and the trigger units. I guess now we can talk about the alternatives a little. Here are some cards that you guys may want to consider. Firstly, we have the Savage Mercenary. Savage Mercenary for the grade 3 slot is an interesting one. So since we are playing Dilophopyro and Savage Shooter, we can actually bring out Savage Mercenary as early as turn 1 or 2. Added on the fact that both Shooter as well as Dilophopyro gauge the superior called unit, you can guarantee that Savage Mercenary has a gauge underneath it so that it can attack. Also, Savage Mercenary works kind of well with Gaia Emperor in a way, because Gaia Emperor gets the power and the critical of the original power and the critical of the unit retired for its cost. So you can imagine if you retire Savage Mercenary, you're adding 27,000 power and +1 crit to Gaia Emperor, meaning the Gaia Emperor is hitting for 39,000 double crit unboosted. That is kind of insane. And with the help of Savage Shooter, you can actually recycle Savage Mercenary very easily from the drop zone, meaning that you can potentially have 2 straight turns where your Vanguard is attacking for like 39,000 double crits. So Savage Mercenary is definitely a solid option for the deck. On that topic, I would also like to introduce the Charged Dragon Dimensional Spark, which is a built-in double crit grade 2 with only 3,000 power, but the built-in double crit means that it can pump Gaia Emperor up to really high crits, though the power will not be that high, so I don't think it's really that relevant, but it's just an interesting thing to consider as well. But actually, another card that I would highly recommend would be Prism Bird if you have the space. Prism Bird is basically the grade 3 searcher for Tachikaze. I just felt that, the reason I used to play it, but the reason that I took it out is because I just felt that most games I do draw into a grade 3, either Gigannoblazer or Gaia Emperor, and that is good enough already. And the deck has enough draw power that, in the early game even, that I don't find myself missing a grade 3 that much. Though if you don't play Prism Bird for the grade 3 searching effect, you can also play it for its continuous effect. If a new equip gauge was put for a unit this turn, it gets plus 5k, meaning that it's hitting for 13k on its own, and if you happen to gauge it, you can hit for pretty high numbers with Gaia Emperor as well. So I guess Prism Bird is a nice card because it's one of your grade 1s that can hit false numbers unboosted, and yeah, this effect just seems pretty inviting. But the only issue with it is that it does not give gauge, nor does it act as a good retire fodder. So I'm kind of iffy about adding Prism Bird, especially now with our grade 1 slots being taken up by so many good retire fodders and Savage Shooter himself. If you're talking about V Premium Tachikaze, we cannot miss out Clear Up Dragon Super Acrocanto. However, I honestly don't think that we need Sweeper Aggro Kanto in this deck, because this deck does not want to hoard gauges to one unit. We want to spread our gauges kind of evenly across the board, and I think that Sweeper Aggro Kanto belongs better to a deck like Engorge or Gigannoblazer. Also, I think it's time for Sweeper Aggro Kanto to rest, because he really had been carrying the entire clan for a very long time now, so he's not going to be in the alternatives. But still, the reason that, players may still consider Sweeper Aggro Kanto is because for its resistability, which will be handy against field wipe decks like the Dragon Empire clans. We have Kagro Blade Master, Narukami Vanquisher or Eradicators, Nibatama Hanzo, Murokuma Hyuga, or Yasue, or even Mega Colony Gradora. But then again, one Rearguard isn't going to win us the game, so I personally prefer the deck to do what it should do well, rather than trying to find counters for every deck out there, which isn't possible in a game like Vanguard. So my stand is you don't really need Sweeper Aggro Kanto in this deck. All in all, Predators and Preys both play very important roles in a deck like Tachikaze. I think I've said this a lot, but the Gaia Emperor deck is probably one of my favorite decks in V Premium, and I think it's the Tachikaze deck that encompasses the most aspects of gameplay that is tied to Tachikaze. It is the one Tachikaze deck that truly bridges the new equip gauge playstyle introduced in V Premium and the self-retire to get more attacks playstyle of old school Tachikaze. I would also argue that the Gaia Emperor deck is more stable than the Engorge deck, with Giganoblazer's draw power being one of the main pillars for us to fall back on. Gaia Emperor, while it may not be as explosive as an Engorge deck that sees all its pieces, can still push for a lot of damage in the turn, and can be just as explosive with the right setup. I've gone games where I've managed to push my opponent from 2 to 5 or even 6 because they don't see defensives and because they give me a ton of counterblast to use the previous turn. This deck can easily make upwards of 6 or 7 attacks a turn easily, and as mentioned earlier in the video, every time we retire we are drawing a card as well. So with this deck, it feels really good just seeing our opponent's hand size go down while ours just keeps going up. This deck does require a bit more brain power to pilot, because you need to consider attack patterns and resource management. And I really like how every game is slightly different depending on which units you end up gauging. All in all, I think it really resembles old school Tachikaze more than the other V Premium Tachikaze decks. When it comes to the main weakness of the deck, I think there are a couple of weaknesses. Firstly is that the deck is pretty reliant on your pieces, and secondly is that the deck is inherently high rolly due to the random calling from gauges. Now, if your opponent is a smart player, they may even damage deny you, which feels really bad because your turns become half done. You cannot fully complete your amazing combo plays, and you have to be really careful about overextending and running out of counterblasts for your plays. Field control decks also can mess us up, especially binding. But against those clans, I think the most important thing is learn when to commit and when not to commit. Don't commit all at one go. Hold back a little, but make sure you're able to do, like a couple of, make sure you're able to push a little every single turn. Slowly push, and once, you can push for game, or at least push them to your death, then that's where you start committing everything to the board. Despite all these weaknesses, I feel that a lot of them has been mitigated quite a bit with the clan selection cards. Like when we talk about hand size and we talk about not being able to see our pieces, we now have more draw power in the deck already. When we talk about our key pieces being retired, we have Savage Shooter to sort of bring them back in a way, unless your opponent also retires Savage Shooter. And also Spinal Extort is just such an amazing card for the deck overall. Especially if you've played the deck, you will realize that games where you see 2 or more Spinal Extorts are the games where things will go really good. True, there will still be games where all your gauging are triggers and your multi-attacks hit like noodles, because these triggers are only 5k, with Gaia Emperor is only 15, and if your opponents check defensives, they're gonna shut down your entire turn. Or there will also be games where you don't see your counter charges, Pollock and Spines, when you need them. You keep drawing blanks or whatever, but all this or the random aspects of a trading card game that you cannot really control. Overall, I really like the Gaia Emperor deck, and I would love to hear your guys' opinions of it if you all have any. Do leave any suggestions or feedback that you guys may have on the deck in the comment section down below, and I'll see you guys very soon. Bye guys!